Good morning, everyone. If it's morning when you're watching this recording, I want to welcome you. My name is Lindell Mitchell. It's been a pleasure for one of my brothers and I to film these classes, and I hope that you've benefited from it at least half as much as I have. It's been a rich study to go back through the book of Esther. And last week we left off about verse 17 or 18, but I'm going to back up to verse 16. The Jews celebrate their victory, and we'll just pick that up and proceed to the end. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defend their lives and rid themselves of their enemies and kill 75,000 of those who hated them. But they didn't lay their hands on plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and 14th of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending portions of food to one another. So following the Jews' slaughter of their adversaries, they celebrate with great victory. Verse 16, to explain the differences between the celebration of the Jews in Susa and those throughout the provinces, the writer summarizes what took place and when it took place in the rest of the empire. While the Jews in Susa had killed 800 enemies, those in the other provinces had killed 75,000. Large number to be sure. The Jews in Susa had been given 2 days to destroy their enemies, to clean that situation up, whereas the folks out in the provinces only needed 1 day. They refrained in the provinces, just like they did in Susa, however, from laying their hands on the plunder. Now some, because it's a large number, have doubted the historicity of the account. They just have a hard time believing that. They apparently have not followed world affairs because slaughters like that have gone on from that time to this. F.B. Huey Jr. has argued that the mass slaughters have been all too common throughout history, and he gave several examples when thousands were killed. Why would the Jews slaughter their enemies and that not have been recorded and reported by secular historians? That's a question for some folks. Well, the deaths were widely distributed throughout a vast empire. And while 75,000 is a lot of folks, when you spread that out over a wide area, it may not rise to the level of being a news event, if you will. And killing of large numbers of people may not have been unusual during that period of time. There is no need to see the numbers as purposely exaggerated. The Septuagint has a smaller number. They may have seen a problem with it and just decided to edit it. But I don't know of any reason to think that it was not as it's recorded in the book. In verses 17 and 18, the different days for combat led to different days of celebration. In the provinces, the victory was on the 13th day, so the Jews rested and celebrated on the 14th day. In Susa, the Jews triumphed on the 13th and 14th days and rested and celebrated on the 15th day. In both cases, the celebrations involved days of feasting and rejoicing. In verse 19, the writer presents these facts to explain why the Jews who lived in the rural communities celebrated on the 14th day of the month. The implication is that originally the Jews in the cities and those in the rural areas celebrated the Jews' deliverance on different days, and the tradition had continued to be observed. The practice had been observed for some time, continuing to the days of the writing of the book of Esther. What apparently began as a spontaneous celebration of this triumph became a matter that was required due to the decree of Mordecai and Esther. And they made it an annual holiday called the Feast of Purim, and stipulated that it was to be observed throughout their generations. Verse 20 through 32 give us the story, the historical story of the institution of the Feast of Purim. Then Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who were in the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and it was a month which was turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday. And they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing, and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Thus the Jews undertook what they had started to do, and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the adversary of all Jews, had schemed against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast pur, that is, the lot, to disturb them and destroy them. But when it came to the king's attention, he commanded by letter that this wicked scheme which had been devised against the Jews should return on Haman's own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they call these days Purim, after the name of the pur. Because of the instructions in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had happened to them, the Jews established and made a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all those who allied themselves with them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days according to their regulation and according to their appointed time annually. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail from among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. The queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, and with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed time, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions for their times of feasting, fasting, and their lamentations. The command of Esther established the customs for Purim, and it was written in the book. Verses 20 and 21. After the Jews' victory and this celebration breaks out spontaneously, Mordecai records the events and then sent letters, that is, copies of a single letter, to all the Jews throughout the empire. Some think that Mordecai's recording these events points to his authorship of the entire book of Esther. I don't know if Mordecai wrote Esther or not, but it seems unlikely that this reference is to the whole book. Mordecai's edict required the Jews to commemorate these victories each year, celebrating on the 14th and 15th days of the 12th month. Michael V. Fox has been cited a number of times, an Old Testament scholar, provided an alternative view, contending that Mordecai's intention was that each locality should observe a single day, while the people as a whole is considered as celebrating both days. Well, those are matters of conjecture and of opinion, and they're harmless as long as you recognize that, because nobody knows. Verse 22, the reason for their rejoicing is clearly given. The Jews had rid themselves of their enemies. Rid themselves is from a word that could be literally translated, had rest from them. That's the New King James. Or got relief from them, the NIV. A month that had been marked out for mourning and tragedy has been changed from sorrow into gladness, from mourning into a holiday. Mordecai said that they should observe the holiday by feasting and rejoicing together and by exchanging gifts and acts of compassion and benevolence. In verse 23, the Jews responded positively to this directive and did what Mordecai had written to them. Actually, they simply continued to do what they'd been doing, for they undertook, it says, what they started to do. Mordecai's letter confirmed the customs they were already observing, applying them to both days, both the 14th and 15th of the month. In verse 21, obliging or establish is from the Hebrew word kum, which elsewhere means validate or confirm rather than command or demand. The author then, in verses 24 and 5, included an explanation for the name of the feast that the Jews were observing. He may have been using the very words of Mordecai that had been written in the letter that had been sent to all the Jews. He first summarized the threat to the Jews. Haman, the Jews' adversary, had schemed to destroy all the Jewish people because of a perceived slight on the part of one man in the person of Mordecai. Tells you a lot about his character, and no doubt the character of the family that he raised. Haman is the adversary. His plot involved using the pur, that is the lot, to disturb and destroy them by casting the lot to determine a day on which the Jews are to be annihilated. And I want you to understand the gravity of this and the imminent danger that they faced, because there are those who are just aghast at the fact that the Jews would defend themselves with such vigor that 75,000 people lost their lives. Well, those 75,000 people were not coming to host a picnic. They were not coming to impose a minor fine or inconvenience. They were coming to annihilate a nation. And the Jews simply defended themselves. The Jews had been saved because Haman's plot had been drawn to the king's attention. That's chapter 7, verses 3 through 6. Ahasuerus had commanded by letter that Haman's wicked scheme should return on his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. And so he responded to that very intensely in the retribution that he ordered. Now, there's some differences between this account and information found earlier in the book, and that are noticeable, but not really problematic. This is a condensed version. And in this condensed version of the events, more credit is given to the king than was given in the earlier narrative. The clause, when it came to the king's attention, tactfully left out the fact that the decree to destroy the Jews and take plunder, take all that they possessed, had been issued in the king's name or by his authority. They don't mention that. It likewise admits here that the matter would have escaped the king's attention if Esther, prompted by Mordecai, had not dared to go into his presence uninvited at peril to her own life. In addition, casting of the lot itself had not caused the Jews to be disturbed or destroyed, but it had determined the day on which they were to be assaulted and killed. And still it might be said to have set in motion the plans that were to lead to their utter destruction. Further, while it is true that the king had Haman and his sons hanged, their hanging did not occur at the very same time. Neither was Haman's execution entirely the consequence of the decree against the Jews, because it had been ordered by the king because of his perceiving an assault against Queen Esther. You recall that when he entered Haman was pleading with the queen at her foot as she lay on the couch, and the king read that as an attempted assault on her. So that was, that part is left out in this compressed narrative. Now you can explain that with two assumptions that I think are reasonable assumptions. Number one, the writer was giving an accurate but incomplete summary, providing as much information as was necessary to meet the purpose he has. Secondly, it is in Mordecai's and in all the Jews' best interest to make the king look as good as you can have him look, and to omit any mention of Mordecai's own role in saving the Jews. And so they're going to give credit to this seemingly absent-minded and egotistical ruler. In verses 26 and 7, the writer, apparently setting aside the account found in Mordecai's letter, then explains that these days, the 14th and 15th of Adar, were called Purim. This name reflects the influence of the pur, which was cast by Haman. In Hebrew, the word Purim is simply the plural form of pur. Mordecai's letter reinforced the Jews' personal desire to celebrate their deliverance. Because of what had been seen and what had happened to them, they would never forget this experience. You can imagine, really, as that day came closer and closer and closer, the amount of stress that these people were under and the amount of anxiety and tension that they experienced. However, the letter from Mordecai to the Jews established a custom of observing their celebration as a commemorative feast. They, along with their allies, we find out about allies, celebrated these 2 days annually. And the phrase, all those who allied themselves with them, undoubtedly refers to proselytes, and it is also possible, even likely, that some Gentiles accepted the Jews' faith and joined them without becoming proselytes, that is, without submitting to the rite of circumcision. Such individuals were later to be called God-fearers. And so they had allies that helped them. The book, therefore, provides the history of how the Feast of Purim began. And this is not the primary purpose of the book, I don't believe, but it is certainly one of the things that it achieves. That is to let us know how Purim came to be. In the last section of the book, the preceding story is emphasized as giving support to the observance of the feast for which there's no authority in the law of the Old Testament. It's just not part of the law. And its name is associated with the incidents recorded in the book. Since Purim lacked authorization from the biblical canon that then existed, it is substantiated by the joint letter of Mordecai and Esther, both of whom are designated as of particular authority. The one by his connection, close connection, to the power and the authority of Ahasuerus as his prime minister, and the other as queen of the empire. In verse 28, a decree was issued regarding the feast. Apparently, the writer is again quoting Mordecai's words. All of the Jews, wherever they lived, to whatever family they belonged, were to observe the feast everywhere for all time. The purpose of the decree was to ensure that the Jews would continue to observe the Feast of Purim, but the purpose of the feast was to guarantee that they would never forget the events that the Feast of Purim commemorates. The memory of their deliverance was never to fade, never be allowed to fade from their descendants. Verse 29, although Mordecai was the prime minister and could sign a decree with the king's own signet ring, his letter was authorized by a letter of confirmation signed by Queen Esther. It's interesting that you see her rising to a position of prominence surrounding these events. Adding royal authority to his own emphasizes the importance and the permanent nature of the decree concerning Purim. What is meant by the second letter that was written to confirm the custom? Well, that's just uncertain. And I'll just say to you very honestly, I don't know. Perhaps it is the correspondence mentioned in chapter 9, verses 30 and 31. It could have been a cover letter or an explanatory note included with Mordecai's decree. But no one knows for sure exactly what he's referring to. In verses 30 and 31, the letters, that is copies of the single letter, that were sent to all 127 provinces of the kingdom, wished the recipients peace and truth. The document was distributed to establish the days of Purim at their appointed times among the Jews. And it is emphasized that the command is in keeping with what Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them. Essentially, it made official the feast that they established for themselves by spontaneously celebrating their deliverance after the massacre of God's people was averted through his divine providence. The instructions from, the instructions from a word dabar regarding Purim were to be passed on just as their other times of feasting and their lamentations were to be continued throughout the generations. They are to remember these events and to respect these events and to respect the times that God has intervened on their behalf. Their times of fasting and lamentations could refer to the traditional observances related to the destruction of Jerusalem. Zechariah talks about in chapter 7 of his book and in chapter 8. Another suggestion is that the language points to a time of fasting prior to Purim in remembrance of these events. The letter was saying that Jewish tradition should include rejoicing and feasting, which occurred on the day of Purim, as well as fasting and lamentation. In verse 32, the story of the institution of the Feast of Purim concludes with the statement that the feast and its customs were established by the command of Esther. In addition to this command was written in the book. What book was that? The usual explanation is that Esther's words were recorded in the official chronicles of Persia. That's certainly plausible. Another possibility is that the book refers to the text of Esther that we've just studied through, which itself may have been an official or at least semi-official record. Perhaps it was written for the benefit of Persians initially, to explain the role of the Jews within the empire and how these events came to be. We move to chapter 10, the epilogue really of the book. It concludes with this brief chapter telling us about some of the accomplishments of Mordecai the Jew. Now, I don't know if it is woke to keep mentioning the fact that he was a Jew, but that's what the text does. And I've got Jewish friends, and not a one of them is ashamed of being a Jew. It was a wide-ranging empire. There were a lot of different tribes and nations and people and language groupings. And so to mention Mordecai's ethnicity is not in any way to slight him. In fact, he was second only to Ahasuerus himself. The text serves as a kind of finale, given the last few details and explanations. Provides, if you will, the happily ever after ending, or at least happily as long as Mordecai continued in power. Michael V. Fox, who divided the book into 12 acts, referred to this chapter as an epilogue, and I think that's a good indicator of what it is. In verse 1 through 3, Mordecai's success is set out. Now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land, that is, he taxed the country, and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and the one who spoke for the welfare of his whole nation. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could be assured that all of our people in positions of high authority, who are well cared for by the American people, had a leadership that it could be said what is said of Mordecai, that he sought the good of his people, not the good of Mordecai, not the good of Mordecai's kin and business associates, but the good of the people. That's a beautiful thing to think about. Maybe someday. Verse 1, the book ends as it began, with a reference to Ahasuerus and his greatness. And as it concludes, it specifies that the king collected a tribute, a tax. The Hebrew word is mas, which usually means forced labor, but probably here refers simply to a tax. And it extended from the land to the coastlands of the sea. The New Revised Standard has on the land and on the islands of the sea. The islands, of course, would be those of the Eastern Mediterranean, which were part of the Persian Empire, at least the area they control. And the idea is probably, as the NIV translates it, throughout the empire to its distant shores. And the statement indicates that he taxed all of the provinces of his kingdom. Now, I've noticed a long time ago that governments tend to do that. Why is a tax mentioned at this point? Well, one idea is that the tax reflects God's providence, that Ahasuerus was rewarded for saving the Jews and was compensated for any loss of funds that the kingdom experienced as per Haman's promise. Remember, Haman promised him thousands of talents of silver. And this may have been, in God's providence, the way to compensate him and to see that the empire didn't lose any money. Another interpretation is that the writer wanted to help the reader to see this as a reversal of the tax relief that the king had granted to all of his princes when he married Esther. That period is over, that tax holiday is over, and now it's going to be reinstated. Most likely, the tribute mentioned in verse 1 is to be connected with Mordecai's service as prime minister, which is spoken of in the next verse. And implied may be the idea that upon Mordecai's recommendation, the king had levied or collected this tax that resulted in prosperity to the king and to the kingdom. And this would illustrate that Mordecai, as prime minister, as first officer, served the king well. In addition to looking after the interests of his own people, he took care of the Persian people and the Persian government. Mordecai's role in Persia can be compared to Joseph's role in Egypt, if you're familiar with that story. Joseph also served his people well. And he also served in the spot second only to Egypt's Pharaoh. And as Pharaoh's second in command, he also benefited the king by opposing a tax on the people of Egypt. So there are parallels there. In verse 2, all the accomplishments of Ahasuerus or Xerxes were recorded in the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia. Media is mentioned first because it was the dominant force in the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire, when the Chronicles apparently began to be compiled. However, at the time of Esther, Persia was the more powerful and dominant member of the alliance. In every other case, the writer of the book of Esther placed Persia before Media. Were these official records of the Persian Empire, or perhaps a Jewish account of the kings? Well, F.B. Huey Jr. thought that the mighty acts of Xerxes, as well as a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, were recorded in the book of the official annals of the kings of Media and Persia. Maybe they were. Maybe they weren't. In contrast, Joyce G. Baldwin thought that the reference was to a Jewish record to which access would be more easily obtained. It seems it's more likely that the reference is to a Medo-Persian document. That's the administration in power. And even if archaeologists never do unearth those particular artifacts, that does not prove that they did not exist. How many times in the past century, the 20th century, did archaeologists disprove the premature announcements of archaeologists preceding them? Scholars used to scoff at the mention of the Hittites because they didn't know where their capital was. They didn't have any confirmation that the empire ever existed until they found the capital and excavated it. Well. The power of Ahasuerus is extolled and talked about here. The chronicles tell of the king's authority and his strength and all the full account of the greatness of Mordecai. And therefore, a later reader could go to these historical records and confirm the facts reported by the writer, as well as discovering further information about the power of Ahasuerus and his prime minister Mordecai. They made a very effective team, it seems. And the writer's statement that all the accomplishments of the king were written down indicates that the book of Esther was not written until after the days of Xerxes. In verse 3, finally the writer eulogizes Mordecai the Jew by giving details concerning his accomplishments. In the Persian Empire, he was second only to Ahasuerus. Among the Jews, he was both great and popular, in favor with his many kinsmen. The New Revised Standard translates that he was powerful among the Jews and popular with his many kindred. Mordecai worked hard on behalf of Jews everywhere, seeking their good, representing them in his dealings with the kingdom's government. And while the New American Standard Bible says that he spoke for the welfare of the whole nation, the King James gives a more literal translation at this point, speaking peace to all his seed. And although seed, zera, means descendants, most translations take it to refer metaphorically to Mordecai's people, to the Jewish nation, rather than to his own descendants. Peace or welfare is from the Hebrew word that's familiar, shalom. It means prosperity in all kinds of aspects of our life. Health, security, material plenty, good relationships. So in striving for shalom for his people, Mordecai also contributed to the shalom of the Persian Empire. The book, which mentions Mordecai before introducing Esther, ends by telling more of Mordecai's story after the last mention of Esther. And it almost seems as if the writer wanted to make the point that one of Esther's main accomplishments was to make it possible for Mordecai, her adoptive father, to become prime minister so that he in turn could benefit the Jews from that position. And seen in this light, the providence of God is evident in Esther's elevation to a position of royalty. Not only results here in the Jews being saved from extermination, but also leads to their being richly blessed in the years that followed by having one of their own serve in such a high position within the Persian government. It has been, for me personally, a great experience to go back through this book yet again and to examine these ancient truths, and to be heartened by the fact that God is always in control and He'll always be with His people. I hope the study has been helpful to you. In the very near future at the Livingston Church of Christ, we will have in-person Bible classes, and we'll have other presentations and offerings to make via internet, the YouTube channel. And we've not determined what those are just yet. But look for us. We'll hope to be there. God bless you.